Well, welcome to TrueWorks, the podcast that helps you understand how the gospel can transform your life and your work. I am your host, Joshua Smith, and with me is my co-host, Dougie Fresh.
Right. Okay,
Yes.
yeah. So that's me. So you know my
Street name.
street name. Yeah.
Yeah.
Back when I was a dealer, that's what folks would call me.
Back, I think it's still a thing.
No, yeah. When people who would come up dressed in your kind of jacket there, you were kind of my customer back in the day. Yeah.
Really? Did you? I guess you had a paying clientele.
I had the best clientele.
Wow.
But that was then. This is now.
Right. That's how you got to where you are now.
No, that's how I almost didn't get where I was right
Okay.
now. Wherever I am, I almost not got there.
Okay. Thanks be to God.
Yes.
Because today we are talking about approaching the world, how to change it, in fact. And this is something that is, I don't know, semi-popular among kind of Christian evangelicals. Go out there and change the world. No, I'm going to retract that. This is just kind of an ethos that goes beyond evangelical or Christians. When we're going out to the world as, say, new graduates, go out and shape it for your liking. Change it for the good. High aspirational callings of, or pursuits, of trying to change it for the better.
Yeah. And why not? Seems like a good idea.
Seems like a great idea.
Yeah.
And of course, doing it for noble reasons is a good idea. The problem, as a practical mind like yourself will always remind us theory people, is how.
Yeah, that is. But I think there's even. I think first of all, let's just move. Let's answer one question. We'll get to how in a moment, but let's answer one question, because James Davidson Hunter in his piece that we're going to ask you to read, and then there's a review of his famous book, How to Change the World by Andy Crouch, called How Not to Change the World. There's a very important premise, and there are a couple of important premises in there. The first is that we as Christians are indeed called to change the world. I think that is true. Thy kingdom come actually means something. It means that we are given.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah.
We are called to change the world. And James Davidson Hunter's basic point with this is that if we're called to change the world, how does the world change? How does the world change? And he observes, I think, postures towards culture, but also strategies to change culture that are common in the church. The most important of which, I think, of the strategy of change is that if I just make more people believe as Christians, then the culture will change.
Yeah.
And he has some pretty depressing news for us in that regard.
He does. And that's not the only option that is on the table. And in his, I guess his book is entitled the same thing, How to Change the World.
Yeah.
And it's a great book. It gets technical at times. He's a sociologist, so he needs to do that kind of stuff. And there are kind of like three basic postures that you can take to the world. And one of them is, and we've mentioned this in previous podcasts, well, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. I don't really need to involve myself with it. Like, God's going to make everything and change the culture when he comes back. My role is kind of, set it out in the dugout, until that happens.
Yeah, I guess my role is like I've said, I think in our last podcast was about, related subject, but I said, we're concerned with purity, so therefore we withdraw from the world. We don't, and thy kingdom come, in that context means that Jesus will come back and do his thing, and that's when the culture will change. And in the meantime, I'm going to withdraw from it and remain pure. Yeah,
and this has its roots, can be traced back to kind of the Anabaptist tradition.
Yeah.
Another kind of response is something like, well, culture is made up of individuals, and so in order to change the culture, we need to change those individuals by conversion.
Yeah.
And that's really the main target of the piece that we give you. That's Hunter's main target, saying that, hey, guess what? We have some bad news for you if that is the kind of cultural process that you seek. that you will use to change the culture. Why is that bad news, Doug?
Well, he has bad news because he points out that the number of Christians doesn't necessarily correlate with cultural change, because culture is actually changed, as he might put it, from the top down. It's not changed from the bottom up. And that if you want to actually change the culture, you need to have influence over or control over high centers of culture. What does that mean in practice? That means that you need Christians shaping the strategy of something like the New York Times or CNN or Fox News, or you might want them being presidents of universities, shaping their strategies. You might want them in other places of cultural power, making movies in Hollywood. And without those culture forming and making institutions, then there's almost no amount of Christians created at the, if you like, at the bottom of the cultural influence pile that will ultimately make a difference to culture.
That will, and he's kind of in effect saying it's not a one-for-one trade.
No.
Right?
No.
Because the influencers in whatever realm, you mentioned several, we could also say business, those leading corporations, they have more influence at their privileged position, at positions of leadership and so on in creation, than do someone at kind of the grassroots level. And so it's going to be more effective if we're looking for cultural change to have those positions. Yeah.
And in fact, I think his basic point out of this book is that without that we need to accept the fact that without access to those kind of higher and more influential regions of cultural power, then there will be no cultural change. The change that or others will direct culture in a different way. And we should say, I think also is that his premise is that we are called to change culture. I think he doesn't really, as you point out, spend a whole lot of time critiquing folks who kind of withdraw from culture and say, okay, we're going to...
Or assimilate.
Yeah, so those are
camp.
the two extremes, if you like. So we will completely withdraw or we'll completely assimilate to culture. No, neither of those are the correct posture. And here, there's maybe a separation here of two different elements of this. So there's the posture towards culture, and that is we can either withdraw, assimilate, or he has a third option that he gets to later in this and called faithful presence, right?
I see, right.
That's the sort of posture, cultural posture. But there's also the mechanism by which culture changes. And his point is that, even if some of those postures were right, no matter which one is right, then if you don't get the people at the top of the cultural tree on your side, then you don't make a change. So there's what is the appropriate posture towards culture thing in Davis and Hunter's piece, and there's also how is the mechanism of cultural change? How does it actually happen?
What are we supposed to do now that we've picked one of these motivations or attitudes or postures?
But he's pretty clear that there's really only, as he would put it, one option towards what should our posture be towards culture. It should be one of faithful presence, as he calls it. In every element of work.
Yes. So let's unpack the very every element of work, because as you've nicely reminded us in this conversation, that Hunter starts off as a premise, and he talks about it in chapters in his book, that Christians are called to change the world. They're called to, in the creation mandate, in the Great Commission, they are called to
change the world.
And he, in his article, specifies that, notice that we are not simply called to change people. We're called to change the world, of which people are a part, but people don't make up everything about the world. There are things that are kind of above and below people are a part of, that we are also called to change. And this ties nicely in, hence our selection of it, of that Jesus himself doesn't just save people. He doesn't just redeem people. Jesus redeems the world, the cosmos. Creation, Paul says, is groaning for the day, for the revealing of the sons of God, right? Jesus' redemption is cosmic, down to our work practices, what Hunter is going to get to, the institutions that we find ourselves in, and if we want that to be redeemed, if we want to change that, then there's a specific posture and, as you said, mechanism that we have to follow.
Yeah, so don't underestimate Hunter's vision, if you like. He is, I think, somewhat pessimistic, I think, overall. It seems to me, at least, or maybe pessimistic based on where he sits in the timeline of Christian history. But still, he feels that we are called to change the world, and that it is the world, not merely individuals. And I think that is something that, as you just illustrated there, he feels that's been largely a mistake of certainly North American Christianity, is that it's focused on the individual, and by doing so actually has not become this powerful cultural force, because we didn't control the mechanisms of culture creation, or we didn't influence the mechanism of culture creation, and therefore the culture that we did produce tended to be kind of ghettoized. It was, it's like Christian music as opposed to music.
Yeah.
He doesn't really have a lot of time for that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, we could write a long list of Christian films that are. There have been some good ones, but not a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I have to say some.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, the thing is that
qualify.
We've talked in the last few podcasts a lot about Terrence Malick. Terrence Malick's movies are more Christian, and he's not really a believer, it seems, but they are certainly more Christian than many of the attempts of Christians to make film.
Yeah.
I mean, they're more profoundly Christian, more connected to the created nature of what we are a part of here. I feel, at least, and that's Hunter's point as well, is that just kind of sampling off a piece and kind of making it this part of culture is Christian culture and others are less so. Yeah. I think has not served us well. And his concept of faithful presence is that what we need people who are informed by the Christian worldview, who are Christian people of practice and love and faithfulness, but also great writers writing scripts for movies that bring forth the fullness of the Christian story. And I think it's hard for me. I mean, I teach this, so maybe I'm predisposed to say this, but it's hard to argue, I think, with that we have, that again, somehow we have turned away from many of the good things of the world and produced cultural goods that really weren't that great.
They're just not very good.
They're just not that great.
Yeah. When you were talking about Malick and being in a profound way more Christian in a sense, and you could nuance that, but I think we understand what you mean. I mean, you're starting to sound like a Thomist. Because,
is that right?
Yes.
Maybe you should explain what that actually is.
Yeah. So the great Thomas Aquinas would call Plato and Aristotle. He called Aristotle the philosopher, because it seemed that even though these two ancient Greek thinkers are writing several centuries before Christ, they are getting it right. The vision of the world, fundamentals about the vision of the world, the nature of the soul, the nature of ethics, so on and so forth, without any contact with the Christian gospel.
Yeah.
And don't we maybe have not put it in the way that you have articulated, Doug, that they're more Christian, but I think it's a pretty common experience to human experience to see something so good or so true or something just overwhelmingly beautiful, and we don't know how to exactly say it, but we say, that is so right, that like gets it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually God's goodness, God's truth, God's beauty. And because of God's common grace, because of the things that he's bestowed upon the world, the world can get at, and we can be part of bringing and creating these goods and these truths and these these beauties along in the world.
Yeah.
But if we don't have this focus, this strategy to take pains of somehow influencing those at the top of the cultural influence, then our efforts are going to be somewhat in vain.
Yeah. So we'll be nuancing this as we go through this, because we've not really spoken about the second thing we actually did by Andy Crouch. But to finish off talking about Hunter,
Yeah.
One of the things about Hunter, it seems to me, is that he is trying to tell us something, that by isolating ourselves from culture, from deciding that we needed to produce Christian music and not great music that was Christian, we actually have reduced our cultural power. So if we wanted cultural power, we actually chose a poor means by which to get it, right? Mm-hmm. Turns out that's not the right way to do it, that we kind of ghettoize ourselves, and we don't create bridges into the main culture that either we can walk across to reach out to folks, or people can walk across to actually come into the community of Christian faith. That by doing what we've done, we didn't build the bridges that we need to build, and that's what we need to do. I think that at the end, it seems to me that James Davis and Hunter is a bit pessimistic of our ability to do that, or that there's a whole bunch of folks out there who are doing it very well, other than maybe him. So,
well, that last point is certainly true, and that's one point that Crouch, I think, makes salient in a very gracious but a clear way.
Yeah.
That, okay, Hunter, if this is kind of the way to go, this kind of faithful presence and cultural influence as at the top of where culture forming happens. Who's doing that other than you, of course?
Yeah. And I think, so Andy Crouch, just to introduce him for a minute, because he may or may not be familiar to you guys, is he's an author of several books, and we've got, what we've asked you to read is his review of Hunter's book, How to Change the World. But Andy himself is a writer of several books on culture creation and cultural change. He's also a partner in a group called Praxis.
And you have involvement with
them?
Yeah,
and we at TrueWorks have partnered with them. I think that's the right word. And we will produce in 2023 a couple of their so-called local labs where early stage ventures and mentors meet together to try and help build these young companies. So his experience, Crouch's, that is one of being part of an organization that actually seeks to build culture from the perspective of a renewed Christian faith. So if you're part of that Praxis movement and you're making, let's say, T-shirts and garments, you're making them in a way that is competitive in the marketplace, but also reflects this kind of deep sense of being a Christian and using the world well and using what the world gives us well. If you're a creative and you're producing music videos or ads for Nike or whatever, there's a way of organizing the various people and parts in these large productions in a way that honors God. So there are cultural making institutions there being formed that have this Christian story right at the center, and Andy Crouch is part of that movement. And therefore, I think this gives him a platform to look at J.D. Hunter, or James Davis and Hunter, and say, hey, he's at the University of Virginia, I think, isn't it, James?
Oh, yeah, for
a long time, very long time.
Yeah.
So he's at the University of Virginia and said, from your lofty perch in the University of Virginia, it may well seem to you that there's not many folks out there that are doing this good work. But from the perspective where I sit, where I'm with these entrepreneurs who are seeking to be that faithful presence, I'm a lot more hopeful than you. I think there is a way for us to create culture and create enterprise and business and do things in a way that honors God and takes the reality of our Christian faith seriously. There is a way of doing that. And boy, I've got many examples I could share with you.
Yeah, the examples that Crouch shares was quite revelatory to me.
Yeah.
Because he said I mean, well, he appraises Hunter. He agrees with
sure.
much of Hunter. But one of the things that he thinks he misses is, well, I know several entrepreneurs, intellectuals, and so on who come from non-cultural centers, and what he means is this kind of institutions that are not in the Ivy League or
that are not the University of Virginia.
That are not University of Virginia, which is always in the top 15, 10 or whatever, that are doing great work.
Yeah,
that are making change in this area and that area.
And I think,
kind of gave me hope. I'm from a Bible college. Maybe God can use me.
Well, for sure he can.
Yes.
Number one. But secondly, I think, and importantly, I think there is a sense where Hunter's work, which I think is good, and I think it does say something important about cultural change and how we change culture. The basic insight that we can have as many Christians as we want to try and create, but not change the culture because we don't have cultural power and cultural influence. I think that is 100% true. 100% true. The one thing that has changed a lot since he wrote that book in the first place was the rise of social media. And there is a sense there where that has both reaffirmed the cultural power. If you're Kim Kardashian, you've got a lot of cultural power. On the other hand, it's also democratized cultural power, where you can have a lot more access to the ability to change cultural power. You don't need a big lofty perch. You just need compelling content.
That's right. Yeah. So it's kind of lowered the prerequisites, right? You don't have to go through now 10 years of grad school.
The barriers to entry are lowered.
Yeah. Okay, that's better. Yeah, that's even.
You're
better
right.
way
That
to say
is
it.
better.
But
that is totally better way to say that.
Yeah, that's why you're my co-host.
Thank you.
And if it's compelling enough, if you're beautiful enough or whatever, then you don't have this.
So what does that mean? It means that I think that we in the past have only had you read James Davison Hunter, you folks that are doing the Faith and Work Intensive. But I think the Crouch review of his work is actually a pretty important corrective. Because number one, it points out that, hey, there are a bunch of people out there that you don't know, James Davison Hunter, that are really doing this work every day, and these are great people. Second, we're all living in a time now where the barriers to entry to this cultural power have been much more lowered. So, culture maker, churches, Christians, get on and use those tools and go change the world. So in the end, how to change the world, I think Crouch has a much more positive view that the world can be changed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he's also, I think, appropriately less ambitious than Hunter, because to go and to change the world could just be your little piece of the world.
Sure, yeah.
And that's faithful presence. Crouch actually likes the idea, but faithful presence may be the influence between you and your 3 children.
Yeah.
Well, and you don't have to be at the head honcho at Nike.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the last word about this, I think that I think for Hunter, it's almost inevitable that he has to kind of claim the need for high ground, because it's intrinsic to his model of cultural change, right? Whereas I think what you see in Crouch is that faithful presence, I think correctly articulated, that it can be that your circle of influence is where you can make cultural change, and the aggregation of that kind of cultural change ultimately can make a difference.
Yeah.
Or it can become that big lever of cultural change that will indeed change the world.
Well, I think that does it for our episode on cultural change, looking at Crouch and James Davison Hunter. If you want to hear other episodes of the TrueWorks podcast, you can find our episodes on any podcasting platform, or you can visit our website at trueworkshouston.org. Thank you so much, and see you next time.